welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 12th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing, John Hogaboom, and Stan Nervlov. I'm Brian Rexroad. And, of course, today is Microsoft Patch Tuesday when we're recording this here. And, Jim, I guess there are some new patches that are pretty important here, right?
Yeah, Brian. Today was a fairly significant one. Microsoft released 8 bulletins that covered 19 CVEs. The biggest one, the most important one, is MS13-090, which is an ActiveX kill bit. It mitigates against a 0-day that was seen in the wild for the last, at least the last 4 or 5 days. So this is a pretty important one to patch. There are a couple other ones that Microsoft deemed critical. They expect reliable exploits within the next 30 days. So, yeah, it's, as always, these patches need to be applied as soon as reasonably possible. But this MS13-090 is a biggie. It's a 0-day that was being actively exploited in the wild right now.
Mm-hmm. Now, just curiosity, and I think I'll put this up for anybody's comments here. Just a little bit off topic, but I noticed, there are a number of these patches that are associated with servers, a number of patches that are associated with client or workstations. And what are your thoughts in terms of the importance? How important is it to get the servers updated? Because I think we have generally talked more about the client side in the past and vulnerabilities associated with that. What are the issues that folks should be thinking about when they are thinking about patching servers? Yeah,
well, when Microsoft releases patches for some of their server products, they're often pretty critical. We've seen some critical patches to some of their server components. It's been quite a while since we saw one for Active Directory, but we see them periodically for things like Exchange and web server components and SharePoint. SharePoint's one that that has gotten some recently. So certainly there are server components that they patch that warrant being patched rather quickly. On the other hand, with servers in the corporate environment, you're going to want to test those out fairly thoroughly before you deploy them, or risk bringing down a chunk of your infrastructure and having lots of upset users. Mm-hmm. But when Microsoft calls them critical, my personal thought is you need to be testing and applying pretty quickly, because there are often server-type components have big, nasty bugs that would allow the bad guys into the servers.
Mm-hmm. I think, many times I think we tend to think of an enterprise as having sort of a network perimeter, so the servers are less accessible. But I don't know, John or Stan, do you have any thoughts about that from an APT perspective?
Well, I think we've seen that happening from the APT world a lot, where servers are being targeted. And actually, we've talked several times on this program here about how APT threat actors go out and scan for vulnerable servers and then use those servers as hacked assets against other victims, unwitting victims. Another important thing to consider for servers is that whereas client computers kind of come and go, they get shut down, there might be mobile server components, they kind of always stay on, and basically they're open at the firewall level for at least some services. So they become big targets for anybody, APT actors, and I know some server type assets were used in DDoS attacks earlier this year. I know John has been investigating that a lot.
Things like domain controllers are big targets that the bad guys, once they've manage to get a foothold in an enterprise, they're going to go after that for credentials to allow themselves to spread throughout the enterprise.
Absolutely. So they use a client workstation that's kind of weak, or maybe it's been exposed to the internet because they logged on at some, through a public Wi-Fi or through a, in a hotel or whatever you call it, or even from home for that matter. They might get compromised at that level and then walk into the enterprise. That becomes a stepping stone for which once the attackers can use that point to get to the servers, if they can compromise those, it's a convenient hiding place and provides the opportunity to go to other places. Yeah.
And, I was just going to jump in, we're talking about Windows patches here. Stan did kind of mention, there were some servers that were used in DDoS attacks. Those were not necessarily Windows servers, but certainly you'd want to be keeping track of what kind of patches are available for any of your internet-facing servers, be they web servers or whatnot. Those I would actually give higher priority to. So if you have these devices that are actually internet-facing, they're web servers, you might be running some kind of content management system like WordPress or whatever, you would want to be highly in touch or in the loop of patch release cycles on those types of devices, because as soon as they're discovered, these attackers can use all kinds of Google indexes and whatnot to find whether your system's vulnerable without even having to scan the internet for them. They can, get right to the vulnerable system. So it's good to patch everything, servers and client machines. I guess it just kind of depends on what the patch is and how much exposure to the internet directly it might have.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I guess good point. It's probably better to be scrutinizing the essence of the patch itself and less about which systems you're looking at. But certainly anything that's exposed to the internet would, I would say, should get some priority. It's going to get discovered one way or another.
Right.
All right, very good. So, Jim, I guess there are some other fixes more in the mobility space as well. Is that right?
Yeah, Brian. The latest version of the Android OS, version 4.4, codenamed KitKat, is just out a week or so, maybe two. It's not shipping on a whole lot of devices yet. Those updates will come shortly. But one of the things that I discovered in reading a couple of blog posts is there's another file verification bypass issue that is fixed in 4.4 that still exists in some of the older versions of the OS. The vulnerability is similar to the one that we talked about back in July time frame. Back then the issue was with the extra field length header of the zip file. The current one is with the file name length header in the zip file. The zip format has been around since the mid-'80s, I believe, and so this is a case where some of the ambiguities in there, the bad guys have found ways to take advantage of them. It's uncertain how soon there might be patches backported to earlier versions, but the issue here is that the bad guys could potentially manipulate an APK, insert some malicious code, and the standard verifications are based on the information in the zip header, so they could potentially bypass some of the normal verification that the content is unchanged.
Hmm. So I think I know the answer here, but what should folks be doing to protect themselves in the meantime?
Right now, there's not a whole lot that they can do.
Well, do we? I guess generally we've been making recommendations to be cognizant of the markets where you're purchasing.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's going to continue to be true. You need to not go install apps off Fred's app market. But yeah, there's and the folks at Google, with the Google Play Store, they're actively looking for apps that are trying to get around this. So if they find them, they'll quickly remove them. But other than that, there's not a whole lot that you can do, on the device to protect against it if you're not running 4.4.
All right, very good. So I guess the next thing we would like to share with you here today, Stan, there's a whole world in the hidden space, and what can you tell us about what's going on behind the scenes?
Well, that space is commonly referred to as the dark web, and we have a link to a Wikipedia entry that describes it a little bit more, but it's basically, this term is used to refer to the things below the surface of the World Wide Web as most of us know it. Most of us access the World Wide Web maybe through some searches. They do through a popular search engine. And it turns out that not everything is indexed by those search engines. So you might not find everything or all types of information. It turns out, based on some studies, that there's quite a lot of information that you won't be able to detect. And it can refer to, all kinds of content, not malicious necessarily in nature. It just could be content that's hidden away behind databases or web pages that are not necessarily accessible to search engines for indexing. Mm-hmm. So the reason we brought this up is because very recently, maybe a couple of weeks ago, F-Secure on their blog, they posted a screenshot from the dark web about somebody who is advertising themselves as a hacker for hire, and specifically his website is titled Rent a Hacker. And it's actually a very interesting post. The person goes on to say that, they've been hacking since about 16 years old and have gotten really good at it and have been doing it for about 20 years or so, and that they're pretty much willing to do anything for money. And right at the bottom of that posting, they have a little, I guess, a shopping cart, and you can buy services, and they're separated into two categories. I guess easy hacking, which is going to set you back about €200, which is probably about $300 to $400, depending on the day. And they have medium to large jobs, which includes things like hacking websites or ruining people's reputations, and that's going to be about €500 from this person. It's a little bit somewhat disturbing the way this person talks about, just doing anything for money and not caring what he's going to do to people, ruining other people's reputations, shutting down businesses. It's a little bit disturbing, but it does give you a little bit of a clue about the psyche, maybe, of this particular person, and maybe some of the ways that, malicious threat actors view the world, and how they maybe rationalize their actions and their activities. So it's an interesting post. It's just one screenshot, and it's got this little, basically, a resume for this hacker of not what he's done, but maybe what he's willing to do, and some of the programming languages that he knows. And at the very bottom is an interesting question that F-Secure poses, and it says, on this resume, on the screenshot, the hacker says that he could be making 50 to 100 euros an hour at a legitimate job, and they say, well, why don't you? So it's an open-ended question. We may not know the real motivations for why this person does something like that, but it's certainly interesting to take a look at this resume. Yeah,
it certainly is. So I think it's important to realize that there's an entire sort of network that's out there that's somewhat invisible, and I presume that a lot of the information about the dark web is either spread through word of mouth or through closed forums where they're exchanging information. And as you stated earlier, the popular search browsers are really looking toward websites that have been identified as indexable and are basically volunteering themselves for that position, so to speak. And a lot of the other sites don't really have that type of thing. So quite a bit that's out there that is relatively invisible otherwise. And this is just one example. There are lots of other things, and we'll show you just a little bit about that sort of thing, or the result of that sort of activity, where denial of service attacks are readily available for purchase, so to speak. And yeah, thanks, Dan. So with that, let's take a look at, I guess, how vulnerable we might be to social engineering. And John, I guess a pretty good example here that you found.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So this is I guess, a cautionary tale that's both a little bit disturbing and amusing at the same time. But we got this report recently on the internet that a security firm, at the blessing of the government, performed a penetration test. And the way that they did it is they created a fake profile of an attractive female and started seeding that profile, creating LinkedIn invites, Facebook friending people, et cetera, that were in this target organization that they wanted to compromise. The interesting thing about this, they provided some interesting stats here. So this, first of all, this pen test was performed back in 2012, and it compromised a government agency that specializes in cybersecurity, but that agency is not specifically called out in the article. They spoofed a new hire at the agency as an attractive, smart female MIT graduate. And within 24 hours of them creating this profile and starting to build connections in LinkedIn, they had 60 Facebook connections, 55 LinkedIn connections, and 3 job offers. So she doesn't even exist, that she's getting job offers at 3 other companies, which I thought was amusing. And then within time, this fake profile of this attractive female received LinkedIn endorsements for her skills when she doesn't even exist or doesn't have any skills whatsoever, and male staffers at that target organization that she was purporting to be working for actually tried to help her out and provided shortcuts for her through the new hire process to get a company laptop and network access without going through the normal channels. And they actually, their pen test team took acquisition of one of those laptops for her, in her stead, as though it was her, this fake person getting it. So they're actually able to acquire one as well, which is interesting. And then around Christmas time, they rigged her profile with a link to a site for a Christmas card. Actually, multiple profiles, on LinkedIn and Facebook and whatnot. In doing so, they compromised several computers at the target organization for lower-level staff members. But still, we talk about this with APT. A lot of these APT actors that we've observed, they don't necessarily shoot for the top of the command chain all the time. They want to get some people towards the bottom, and then they can laterally move and acquire other assets within the company once they have that as a stepping stone. And in this particular case, they're able to escalate their privileges just like an APT actor would, gain administrative rights, and they're able to steal sensitive documents and sniff passwords off the network. This is very similar to another case, another pen test that was done back in 2009 called the Robin Sage pen test, which has kind of gotten some notoriety, and it actually, I think it's kind of like a case handbook for the government on how and what not to do in this kind of scenario when it arises. So a few preventative measures. Now, you actually, I think, Brian, you had done a report maybe 3 weeks or so ago, because it was Cybersecurity Month last month, with a little bit more extensive guidelines around this. But these are some of the ones maybe kind of tailored to this specific case that they called out. So you would want to question, so there's 2 aspects, I guess I should mention: user education and how you would want to protect your systems, which are 2 different things. And typically, humans are the weakest link in your security chain, in my opinion. So anyway, the user education standpoint, you want to have them think and question any suspicious behavior, report it to HR. More importantly, have some kind of point of contact to report phishing by phone or email, so that maybe you have a security team distribute some awareness so that people inside the company know something strange is going on here. I'm getting solicited through email or some other means. Maybe I need to contact my security office or ask protection or HR or all of the above to find out what's going on here and make sure it's not something fishy going on. Refrain from sharing work-related details on social networks. That was actually one of the reasons they were actually, in this particular pen test, they were able to compromise the computer of the top of the food chain at this particular government agency. And the way they did it is they happened to observe, that this fake profile of this person had friended other people in that organization through Facebook. And two of those people in that organization were talking, about happy birthday to our head of security. I'm not sure what his title was. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, this person was able to see that and then sent a fake birthday card that was weaponized so that when the head of security opened it, spoofing it as though it was from this employee that was talking about happy birthday, and they were able to compromise that person's machine, the head of the bigwig within that organization.
Right.
Don't use work devices for personal activities. That gets more and more difficult as there's the whole bring your own device type initiatives going on in various organizations and companies. But that's a good one to be mindful of. And then in terms of protecting systems, protecting access to different types of data with strong and separate passwords is very important. We talk about it all the time. Don't use one password for all your systems that you use. Have different passwords. Try not to use schemes that are easily discoverable. If you have one password on one system and it follows some kind of obvious scheme, don't use that same scheme all the way throughout. And then segment your network so that if attackers compromise and they get like an employee asset that might be, accessible to Facebook or LinkedIn or these other kind of pseudo, not necessarily work-related activities, that device is separate from ones that can access, more sensitive data. So you'd want to have, some kind of network segmentation with different devices that access your sensitive information.
Yeah, John, I think you've hit the nail on the head with a lot of these things. You mentioned that humans being the users sort of being the weak link. I think that's basically true in the state of affairs that we're in today. I personally think that's pointing to a technical challenge that hasn't really been solved. That is, we really shouldn't be using technology that depends on the user to make judgment about that technology itself. So, in my opinion, it's a matter of incompleteness, but you're entirely accurate in the sense that that's the way it is today, and so users need to be educated and prepared to help defend. And just to share a little bit of a personal experience, I happen to have be a participant in some social networks, and I had a friend that had actually somebody had duplicated, so to speak, their account, created one with the same name, stole pictures from that person's account, and then proceeded to try to friend folks. And there were just a couple of little things that indicated that it was a suspicious behavior. So a little bit of a variation on this particular example where they created a fictitious one. You should also be a little bit suspicious about ones that appear to be real people that you even know. And making sure that, you're expecting that sort of relationship to be developed with those folks.
Right. And, we've observed in the past, over the years, targeted APT attacks that obviously are heavily leveraging LinkedIn and other social networks so that they kind of figure out, okay, who does this person at the target that I'm interested in, who are they linked in with, so I can find out, maybe use that person as a spoofed source so that that my target will open that email. Mm-hmm. This case is slightly different, a little bit more advanced version where they're, maybe playing on, the whim of, in the IT industry, it's very male-dominated, so they're all, hey, there's an attractive woman in our organization, all of a sudden everybody wants to be her friend. That's not necessarily the case in all the types of attacks we see. This is a special case, but as they were able to prove here, it is a highly successful one. Another thing I didn't point out is they tried a similar attack with a male profile, a fake person that was male, and tried to LinkedIn and make friend contacts and whatnot, and it completely and utterly failed. So that kind of tells you how successful it is to use this type of tactic, and it's something to be watchful for or mindful for when you get maybe unsolicited LinkedIn invites, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Hey, John, I think I read this article as well, and there was another interesting point is that one of the people that this lady tried to friend actually said, you know, I don't think I know you, and tried to challenge her. And I think what what the researchers did in that case is they looked at his events that he was part of, and they just wrote back saying, hey, I know you from that event. Remember where we met, or something like that. And you know, a few responses later, he said, yeah, actually, I do remember you. So it's a very interesting tactic, and a lot of people, even after challenging, might still, you know, fall for the second round because there is a level of interaction. You know, it doesn't make you think that this is, you know, somebody could be just targeting you specifically. That was a very interesting tactic, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen other cases with more directly in the spear phishing, where spearfish has been sent out and people have noticed that it looks a little suspect, replied back. Is this replying back to the attacker per se, saying, is this a legitimate, you know, request here? And the attacker will reply and say, yes, it's a legitimate request. So occasionally that's just enough reinforcement to let it work.
Yeah, you need some out-of-band kind of way of verifying.
Some sort of out-of-band and a more personal connection than what you're doing on the either through the friending process or the messaging that's on there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that, I think obviously people can be attacked, and I guess bots can be a part of that too. Can you tell us a little more, Jim?
Yeah, this was an interesting article I saw last week. My friend Daniel Sid on the SecuriBlog noted some things they had discovered. They were blocking some attacks, some SQL injection attacks that they discovered were coming from Google bot IPs. That got them thinking, you know, what the heck is going on here? And it's, you know, not just Google, but you know, any of these web search firms that have their bots crawling all these web pages. What they do is they follow the links on those pages, you know, see where they go to try to build out their index a little further. And what happened was some folks had stuck some malicious links in some of their pages that were attempting to do SQL injection attacks against remote sites. And so the bot browsed to these malicious pages, followed the links, and turned around and launched the SQL injection attack against the target, against the victim address. You know, and this was a case where Daniel discovered this. You know, he works for a firm that does web application firewall kinds of stuff, but they were whitelisting the Google bot IPs, and as a result, these attacks were getting through. And so, you know, it was something to worry about. They've notified Google, and not sure what Google is going to do if they'll start trying to sanitize some of the you know, links that they're following. But this could be done by you know, through any of a number of search engines, you know, benign or somewhat less than those with less than stellar reputations. My home website, I already block the bots from a couple of search engines from Russia and Ukraine and China, because I don't figure folks from there are actually going to be looking for my website anyway. So it's not just Google. Google happens to be the one that Daniel noticed in this case, but it's any search engine is potentially an avenue for the bad guys to use for attack. If they can entice the search engine to, index their page, and they've got these malicious links in there, you could conceivably induce the company that's got the search engine to launch your attacks on your behalf.
Mm-hmm. So this looks like it's kind of in the gray space between what John had referred to it earlier about being able to use searches to identify specific versions of software that might be susceptible to attack, and what Stan had talked about a little bit earlier about the dark web. This is kind of that, we can search what was intended to be kind of dark, the malicious activity, and consequently find attacks that have already taken place, so to speak.
Yeah, somebody went out, did their due diligence to figure out that some other website has this, potentially has the SQL injection vulnerability, and then they put the link on their own web page, get the search engine to crawl it, and follow that link, and in following that link, they launch the attack.
All right, that's a unique story. Very good. Thank you.
I was going to say the long and short of the story, though, is you should, if anything, at least this would make you aware of the fact that maybe I have some SQL injection vulnerabilities I need to clean up on my machine. If it's that well known and now Google has it indexed and, they're actually trying to, compromise my website, hopefully you're going to go clean up those vulnerabilities.
That's the glass half full, John. They saved a little money on a vulnerability scanner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very good. So with that, let's take a little bit of a look at the activity that's taken place on the Internet in the last week or so. And first one here is basically a continuation of something we reported on last week. This is scam probes on port 5038 TCP. That's the asterisk voice over IP management port. And as very consistent, I just edited actually a few things here from last week's report. It's mostly from a single address at a time. There's pretty strong evidence that even though it's a single address at a time, it's moving around to different places in different countries. In this particular example, the top sources that I found were from China, Korea, and the United States. But there does appear to be a relationship here in that when I look at other ports that are being scanned, there's a pretty strong consistency between them. One change from last week to this week is that port 25 was added to the mix. So we saw activity on not just port 5038. We had reported previously on 3389, 443, and port 80, but also port 25 is added to the mix, and that would be simple mail transport protocol, SMTP. So with that, that activity is continuing to take place, not particularly aggressive, but and it's very spiky in nature, probably the transition between different IP addresses being a good portion of what's causing that to be spiky. Next item here is we got an alert that's related to the number of sources that appear to be performing scanning activity on port 3074 UDP. It turns out this is probably actually representative of peer-to-peer activity. Most of the sources are associated with consumers and pretty consistent with what we'd expect to see in gaming activity. And this particular port does happen to be associated with Xbox game port, and most likely related to if you haven't noticed in the television advertising, they're promoting a lot of new games that are getting released just before the holiday season here. And this is likely an increase in activity associated with a particular game release in the last week or so. So not security related in particular, but certainly an observable set of activities that you might witness on your network. Next item here, scam probes on port 1080 TCP. That's a port that's associated with SOCs or assigned to SOCs, that being basically a proxy port for accessing other systems. Most of the probes that we're seeing here are from a single address in China, and that address also is doing scanning on a number of other ports that are a little bit odd, in my opinion. First of all, 3389 is one that we'd expect to see that possibly looking for opportunities to get remote access to systems, but I also saw 8088, 4455, 5566, and 1188 some odd choices, in my opinion. It might be just sort of sequencing through a number of other ports as they do things, but I'm not sure, because I'm not sure of any specific applications associated with those ports or a particular relationship between them. There were several other sources scanning on this port, by the way, from various other countries, but I think what we observed on this address from China was on the level of about two orders of magnitude greater, at least at this particular point, on the, looks like November 10th. Next item here is to look at the top 10 most probed ports, and there were a large variety of ports that showed up in probing. This is a significantly larger field of other than we typically see. And so that could be related to a variety of activities, but could be some sort of broad port scanning activity as well. We also see the port 53 UDP, as we've mentioned a number of times before, that could be largely related to spoof source addresses, sending queries out to a number of open DNS resolvers to facilitate DNS reflection attacks. And as usual, port 445 is high on the list, port 1433 high on the list, and then port 80 and port 3389 showing up in here as well. And of course, we see activity for the zero-access botnet peer-to-peer activity, and we're going to take a little bit of a look at that next here. What I did is picked up activity for the last 90 days for the zero-access botnet, and this is on ports 16465, 16464, 16471, and 16470. And this is the basically the level of activity that's taking place, not necessarily representative of the number of participants, but certainly is most likely representing the number of participants. So over the last 90 days, you can still see where there had been a takedown performed by Symantec some time ago, and then a couple of spikes of increased activity, and certainly since then a strong upward trend in activity, basically indicating a rebuild of that botnet, and it seems to be stronger than ever. And when I'd previously taken a look at a year ago, in fact, perhaps a little bit beyond that, this is as strong as we've ever seen this, or is at least as active as we've ever seen this botnet. So certainly one to be paying attention to. Fairly easy to recognize this botnet because of the UDP activity, and also relatively easy to block in an enterprise firewall. In fact, that may be somewhat deliberate from the botnet operator's point of view. They may be looking for users that are not hindered by our firewall, but certainly ones that end consumers should be considering paying attention to. And last but not least here, I wanted to share with you an update in trend activity associated with the DNS reflection attacks. This is showing the daily count of attacks that have been detected over the last 2 years. So this has no bearing or no direct bearing on how big the attacks are. It's just the frequency of attacks on a given day, or the count of the number of attacks on a given day over the last couple of years. And so what we're seeing here is that activity in June. It was actually the third week in June. In 2012, there was a significant uptick in activity. It went from about 50 to roughly about 300 events per day. And we're seeing a continuously updating, increasing trend in activity. I'm showing here a trend that's basically looking back 200 days to generate that trend line. It's a 200-day average. And it continues to go up. It looked like there was a little bit of a lull in activity, so to speak, but not one that I would consider to be a very positive trend. And just in the within October, I think around October 16th or so, we had a new record in terms of the number of events detected in a single day, up around 3,600 events in one day. That is, and an event, by the way, is an attack. If an attack continues more than an hour, it gets counted again. So it has some relationship to the persistence of a given attack, as well as the number of different targets of attack that have been detected. So certainly a disturbing trend to see new peaks of that type. And we have seen indications that the strength of the attacks, although most of these attacks aren't significantly large, we certainly have seen cases where the strength of attacks over time has been increasing as well. I we defended against one in July that was upward around 50 gigabits per second and persisted over several hours. So certainly we'll want to be paying attention to inhibiting open DNS resolvers, and what I'm not particularly a proponent of not having an open DNS resolver, but if it is open, it certainly needs to have some kind of controls in place to make sure that it's not a participant in attacks. And then on top of that, be prepared for denial of service attacks. A lot of these attacks are going against a variety of targets that you wouldn't necessarily expect otherwise. And by the way, this is basically attributable to relatively low-cost denial of service attacks for hire. And perhaps we should, at sometime in the future, talk a little bit about that in more detail. And that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter, our handle at ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq, and it's also available on YouTube if you prefer. You can subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes. I would like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim, John, and Stan, for your inputs. Very good. And I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.